Welcome, friends, and walk close beside me tonight, for we are setting out on a tender and sorrowful journey. A journey among the graves of the ones who gave us a song. Not the towering legends whose names still blaze in lights, but the others, the ones who burned bright for a single golden season and then were gone. The one-hit wonders and the faded stars, the voices that once poured out of every radio and jukebox in the land and then, somehow, slipped from the world's memory. There is a special heartbreak in their stories, for they knew, however briefly, the dizzying heights of fame, the screaming crowds and the #1 records, and then they knew the long, quiet fall afterward, the empty rooms and the unreturned calls and the slow forgetting. And when at last they died, so many of them died young, or poor, or alone, and were laid in graves that the world, which had once adored them, could not be bothered to visit, some of them lying for years beneath no stone at all. Tonight we will remember them. We will travel from cemetery to cemetery, 30 of them across our whole journey, 15 tonight and 15 more a little further on, and at each grave we will pause and play again, in memory, the one sweet song they left us, and we will speak their names into the quiet, so that for a moment at least they are not forgotten. You will know some of these songs the moment I name them, I am sure of it, for they are woven into the fabric of our lives, played at our weddings and our proms and our long drives through the night. And yet how many of us could name the singer, or say what became of them, or guess how many lie in graves the world has utterly forgotten? That is the strange fate of the one-hit wonder and the faded star, to have their song outlive their name, to give the world something it will treasure forever, while they themselves are let slip quietly into the dark. So take my arm, and lower your voice, and let us go gently among the ones who gave us a song and then were gone. So take my arm, and lower your voice, and let us go gently among the ones who gave us a song and then were gone. Let us begin at the St. Raymond's Cemetery in the Bronx, New York, at the grave of Frankie Lyman, whose story is perhaps the most heartbreaking of them all. Lyman was a marvel, a boy of just 13 with a soaring, angelic voice who exploded out of the streets of Harlem in 1956 with a song that raced to the top of the charts and made him, overnight, one of the very first African-American teenage pop stars, a sensation adored around the world. But fame that comes at 13 is a cruel and fleeting thing, and by the time he was 16 he was already a has-been. His voice changed, his moment passed, and he slid into the addiction that would haunt the rest of his short life. He was just 25 when he was found dead of an overdose on his grandmother's bathroom floor. And then came the final indignity. For a bitter legal battle among the women who each claimed to be his widow left his grave, for many years, entirely unmarked, the boy who had once been the toast of the world, lying in anonymous ground. To hear that famous record even now is to be startled by the purity of it, the effortless, joyous soar of a 13-year-old voice that seemed to promise a lifetime of music, and it is almost unbearable to set that sound against what became of the boy who made it. He was a child thrust into a grown-up world of touring and money and temptation, with no one truly looking out for him, and the industry that had squeezed him dry at 13 simply discarded him when his voice broke and the hits stopped. The addiction that followed was the slow tragedy of his short life, and the fortune his record had earned was tangled up in lawsuits and lost. That his grave should then have sat unmarked for years, while the courts argued over which of his widows had the right to his name, feels like the cruelest possible ending. The bright angel of the airwaves left in anonymous ground, remembered by almost no one, until at last a measure of recognition came to the spot where he lies. There is a terrible lesson in his story, one the music business has repeated again and again, of a gifted child chewed up and spat out by an industry that saw him only as a product, handed fame and money he was far too young to manage, and then abandoned the moment he stopped being profitable. He was, by all accounts, a sweet and generous soul beneath the tragedy, and the friends of his youth mourned him deeply. Speak his name then, and remember not the sad end but the miracle of that voice, the pure, soaring joy of a Harlem boy who, for one shining year, sang his way into the hearts of the whole world. Speak his name then, gently, and remember the miracle of that pure young voice, and the sweet doomed Harlem boy who owned the world for a single year and was let go so carelessly by all who profited from him. He rests here now, the angel-voiced boy whose brief, bright fame the world let slip away. Let us travel now far to the south, to the New Park Cemetery in Memphis, Tennessee, to the grave of Johnny Ace, a rising star whose light was extinguished in an instant. Ace was one of the most promising young talents in all of rhythm and blues. A smooth, the romantic balladeer whose string of hits in the early 1950s had made him a fixture of the R&B charts and one of the brightest hopes of a new kind of music, poised, many believed, to become a true crossover star. But on Christmas night of 1954, backstage between sets at a concert in Houston, in a moment of reckless horseplay with a pistol he believed to be safe, the gun discharged, and he was killed instantly, at just 25 years old. In a bitter irony, his most beautiful record was released only days later, and it became a huge posthumous hit, making him the first artist ever to top the charts only after his death. He had come up through the thriving Memphis music scene, a preacher's son with a smooth, aching voice that owed something to the great jazz balladeers, and in a lightning-fast rise he had scored hit after hit, 8 in a row by some counts, until he stood among the most popular figures in all of rhythm and blues, a genuine matinee idol for the jukebox age. He toured constantly, often sharing bills with the biggest names in the music, and everyone who saw him agreed that even greater things lay ahead. And then, in a single senseless instant on Christmas night, all of that promise was erased. A young man of 25 gone in the time it takes a hammer to fall. The record that was climbing the charts as he died became a monument to him. A beautiful, mournful ballad of eternal love that topped the charts for weeks and made him, strangely, more famous in death than he had been in life, the first of many stars whose greatest fame would come only from the grave. His influence far outlasted his brief life, for his smooth, romantic style pointed the way toward the soul balladeers who would follow, and no less a figure than the young Elvis Presley recorded that same aching love song in tribute. Speak his name, then, and remember the fastest rising star of his moment, a preacher's son with a voice like warm honey, who might have become one of the giants had a single, careless instant on a Houston Christmas not stolen everything away, and who lies now in Memphis soil far from the spotlight he had so nearly conquered. The great crowds that had once thrilled to his voice thinned quickly after his death, as they always do, and today his name is spoken mainly by devoted students of early rhythm and blues, though the ballad that became his epitaph still surfaces now and then, as tender and as haunting as the day it was cut. To stand at his grave in Memphis is to feel the cruelty of a talent extinguished at its very dawn, a young man who had every gift but time. He was, at the time of his death, more popular on the rhythm and blues charts than almost anyone, a fact that makes the completeness of his later obscurity all the more startling. He rests here now, the promising balladeer whose Christmas song became his epitaph. Let us travel now to the west, to the Evergreen Cemetery in Los Angeles, to the grave of Jesse Belvin, one of the great unsung talents of early rhythm and blues. Belvin was enormously gifted, a silky-voiced singer, and a brilliant songwriter who co-wrote one of the most beloved doo-wop songs of all time, a tune that sold in the millions, and who scored his own tender hit that became a beloved sign-off theme for a generation of disc jockeys. He seemed poised for real and lasting stardom. But in 1960, driving home through the night after a concert, his car was involved in a head-on collision that killed him, his wife, and their driver, and he was gone at just 27. Suspicions lingered that his car had been tampered with, but nothing was ever proven, and one of the most talented and least remembered names in the history of R&B was laid quietly to rest beneath a simple flat marker. He was, by the accounts of everyone who worked with him, one of the most naturally gifted musicians of his generation. A singer of such smooth and effortless beauty that he was sometimes called the Black Elvis, and a songwriter whose melodies seemed to pour out of him without effort, one of which became an eternal doo-wop standard sung at proms and weddings for generations. He was on the verge of the crossover stardom that had eluded so many black artists of his time, newly signed to a major label and being groomed as a sophisticated pop balladeer. But driving home exhausted through the southern night after a landmark integrated concert, his car met another head-on, and he and his wife and their driver were all killed, and he was gone at 27. The whispers that his car had been sabotaged in revenge for that integrated show were never proven, but they added a further layer of sorrow to the loss of one of the sweetest and most unjustly forgotten voices of his age. His fingerprints are all over the music of his era, on the standards he wrote for others, and the effortless recordings he left behind. And yet his name is known today to almost no one but the deepest students of the music, a giant hiding in plain sight. Speak his name then, And remember the impossibly smooth voice and the generous songwriting gift, and the cruel highway that took him and his wife together at 27, leaving behind a tender goodnight song that would, in the end, sing him to his own rest beneath the Los Angeles ground. For years, the mystery of the crash lingered, the unproven suspicion that someone had wanted to silence a black star who dared to headline an integrated Southern show. And though no answer ever came, the shadow of it deepened the sorrow of his loss. To visit his simple marker in the vast Los Angeles cemetery is to remember one of the most gifted and most overlooked voices of the whole doo-wop era. A man whose songs everyone knows and whose name almost no one does. He rests here now, the silky-voiced talent whose goodnight song became his own. Let us travel now to the Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Cypress, California, to the grave of Eddie Cochran, one of the founding geniuses of rock and roll, dead before he ever reached his prime. Cochran was a rockabilly original, a handsome and prodigiously gifted young guitarist and singer whose driving, rebellious anthems captured the very spirit of teenage America and influenced virtually every rock musician who came after him. He was only just beginning, a star on the rise with a string of classic records already behind him. But in 1960, while touring in England at the height of his early fame, the taxi carrying him crashed on a dark road and he was killed at just 21 years old, his guitar reportedly thrown from the wreckage. He left behind a small but immortal body of work, and a sense of vast promise forever unfulfilled. He was a prodigy, a self-taught guitarist of dazzling ability, and a songwriter with an instinct for the frustrations and joys of teenage life. And in his handful of years in the spotlight, he created a body of work so influential that the giants of the next generation, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and countless others, would study and cover his records with reverence. He seemed to embody the very future of the music, young and handsome and bursting with ideas. He had, it was said, a premonition of an early death, and had spoken of wanting to give up touring to concentrate on writing and producing. But fate did not give him the chance, and on a dark English road in the spring of 1960, the taxi, speeding him toward the airport, blew a tire and struck a lamppost, and he was thrown and fatally injured, dead at just 21. The music he might have made haunts the imagination still, a whole career of genius cut off at its very first flowering. The records he made in his few short years have never aged a day, still crackling with the same restless energy and wit that first electrified a generation, and every young musician who ever picked up an electric guitar owes him a debt, whether they know his name or not. Speak his name then, and remember the handsome, brilliant boy who helped invent the sound of rebellion, whose premonitions of an early death came so cruelly true on a dark English road, and who lies now in California, 21 forever, his summertime blues playing on without him. In England, where he died, his memory was kept especially alive, honored by the very British musicians his records had inspired, so that in a strange way he found a kind of immortality far from home. To stand at his grave in California is to mourn not only the 21 years he was given but the 50 more he was not, the countless records never made, the whole career of a founding genius sealed away in a single instant on a rain-slicked English road. Speak his name then, and remember the brilliant, handsome boy who helped invent the sound of rebellion and was gone at 21, his greatest work forever unmade. He rests here now, the rockabilly pioneer whose summertime blues never grew old. Let us travel now far to the east, to the Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Beaumont, Texas, to the grave of the Big Bopper, whose booming voice and single giant hit made him a rock and roll immortal. Born Giles Perry Richardson, the Big Bopper was a disc jockey and songwriter who struck gold with a novelty rock and roll number, a swaggering, hiccuping celebration of a pretty girl that became one of the defining records of its era. He was a one-hit wonder in the truest sense, but what a hit it was. Tragically, his fame lasted only months, for in February of 1959 he climbed aboard a small chartered plane on a freezing night, along with two other young stars, and the plane went down in an Iowa field, killing everyone aboard on the night that would forever be remembered as the day the music died. He was just 28. He was a big, warm, larger-than-life character, a popular radio disc jockey with a gift for showmanship, who invented a swaggering alter ego and, almost on a whim, recorded a cheeky, hiccuping novelty song that unexpectedly became one of the biggest hits of its day, its opening telephone patter known to virtually everyone in America. He wrote songs for other stars too, and seemed to have a bright future as a performer and a writer both. but he had been on the road for weeks on a grueling package tour, traveling by freezing, broken-down bus. And when the chance came to charter a small plane to the next town and get some rest, he took it, giving up his seat on the bus to another young musician. The plane rose into a snowy Iowa night and came down minutes later in a frozen field, killing everyone aboard. And the day of that crash has been mourned ever since as the day the music died, a single catastrophe that took 3 bright young stars at once. There is a haunting generosity woven through his final hours, for it was his willingness to give up a cramped bus seat for the comfort of a plane, and another's willingness to yield a seat to him that placed him aboard that doomed little aircraft. So that chance and kindness together sealed his fate. Speak his name then, and remember the big, warm, laughing showman behind that one unforgettable song. A man who reached the very peak of his fame only to lose it, and his life, in the space of a single freezing minute above an Iowa field. On the night the music died, his young widow was expecting their child when he died, a son who would grow up to sing his father's songs and keep his memory alive. And decades later, the singer's body was moved to a new grave, marked by a proud historical marker. To stand there in Beaumont is to remember that the day the music died took not only 2 teenage legends but a warm, funny grown man, at the height of a fame he had waited his whole life to taste. Speak his name then, and remember the big, laughing showman and his one swaggering hit, and the freezing Iowa night that took him and 2 other bright young stars all at once. He rests here now, the booming voice of a single golden song, silenced in a winter field. Let us travel now back to California, to the Eternal Valley Memorial Park in Newhall, to the grave of Gene Vincent, a true pioneer of rock and roll whose life was a long, sad decline. Vincent burst onto the scene in 1956, with a smoldering, hiccuping classic that became one of the anthems of early rock and roll. And for a moment, in his black leather and his greased hair, he was one of the most electrifying and dangerous figures in the new music. But a devastating motorcycle accident had already left him in chronic pain, and as the hits dried up, he spiraled into alcoholism and financial ruin, his body and his career slowly breaking down together. He died in 1971, at just 36, largely forgotten in his own country, though still revered abroad. He was one of the true wild men of early rock and roll, a Navy veteran with a menacing, leather-clad image and a hiccuping, feverish vocal style that made his first great record an instant classic and a huge international hit, and for a moment he stood alongside the very biggest names in the new music, adored by the first generation of rock and roll fans on both sides of the ocean. But a serious motorcycle crash had shattered his leg and left him in constant grinding pain, and he took to drink to endure it. And as the American hits dried up, he found himself chasing a fading stardom through the clubs of Europe, his health and his finances collapsing together. It was in that same English car crash that took a fellow star that he was badly injured, surviving only to decline further over the following decade. He died at just 36, all but forgotten in his homeland even as European fans kept his flame alive, a founding father of the music reduced to a ghost of his former self. It is one of the quieter tragedies of early rock and roll, this slow fading of a man who had once seemed its very future, worn down by pain and drink and neglect, while the music he helped create went on to conquer the world without him. Speak his name then, and remember the dangerous magnetic figure in black leather, who gave the world one of its first great anthems, revered across an ocean even as his own country forgot him, and who came at last, at just 36, to a quiet grave in a California valley, his wild early fire long since guttered out. The tragedy of his decline is that he never stopped being a great artist, even as the world stopped listening, still capable of thrilling the faithful in some small European club, while his own country acted as though he had never existed. To visit his grave in the quiet Newhall Valley is to remember the electric danger of his early records, and to mourn a founding father of rock and roll who died broke and hurting and half forgotten at just 36. His records still turn up on rockabilly compilations and in the collections of the faithful, crackling with the same feral energy that once made him a star, a reminder of how thrilling and how new that first wave of rock and roll truly was. He rests here now, the leather-clad pioneer whose wild first anthem outlived his fame. Let us travel now to the Jim Reeves Memorial Park near Carthage, Texas, to the grave of Gentleman Jim Reeves, one of the smoothest voices country music ever produced. Reeves was an enormous star, a former baseball player turned singer whose warm, velvet baritone and gentle, sophisticated ballads made him one of the most beloved country artists in the world, his records selling in the millions across the globe. He seemed to have decades of stardom ahead of him, but in 1964, at just 40 years old, the small plane he was piloting was caught in a violent thunderstorm and crashed near Nashville, killing him and his manager. His records went on charting for years afterward, but the man himself was gone, and though his devoted fans built him a shrine, the wider world has largely let his velvet voice fade into silence. He had one of the most gorgeous voices in the history of country music, a warm, intimate, honeyed baritone that seemed to whisper directly into the listener's ear, and he used it to build an international empire of gentle, sophisticated ballads that made him a superstar not just in America but across the globe, beloved as far away as Africa and India and beyond. He had begun as a baseball player, turning to music only after an injury, and he seemed to have countless golden years ahead of him. But he was also a licensed pilot, and one summer evening in 1964, flying his small plane back to Nashville through a sudden violent thunderstorm, he lost control in the driving rain and crashed into the woods, dying with his manager at just 40. So beloved was his voice that new records assembled from his recordings kept reaching the charts for years, an eerie afterlife of stardom, even as the gentle man himself lay beneath a life-sized statue in the Texas soil, slowly slipping from the world's memory. So enormous was his international following that in some corners of the world he remains, even now, more beloved than almost any American singer, his gentle records passed down through generations who never knew he had been gone for more than half a century. Speak his name, then, and remember the warm, velvet baritone that soothed the whole world. The former ball player who became a global superstar, brought down in his prime by a summer storm, and lying now beneath his own statue in the Texas earth, his song still drifting, softly, out of radio's A World Away. The elaborate shrine his fans built, with its life-size statue and its one-acre grounds, stands in poignant contrast to how thoroughly the general public has forgotten him, a monument to a fame that once spanned the globe and now lives mostly in the hearts of the aging faithful. To stand there near Carthage is to remember the warm baritone that once poured out of every radio in the world, and the summer storm that silenced it at 40. His Christmas recordings in particular have become quiet perennials, drifting out of speakers each December, so that many who hear that warm baritone have no idea they are listening to a man gone for more than 60 years. Speak his name, then, and remember Gentleman Jim and his honeyed voice, a global superstar in his day, brought down by a summer storm and slipping now, year by year, from the memory of the world he once enchanted. He rests here now, the velvet-voiced gentleman whose song outlasted the storm that took him. Let us travel now to the Ridgecrest Cemetery in Jackson, Tennessee, to the grave of Carl Perkins, the man who wrote the very anthem of rock and roll and then watched another man become its king. Perkins was a rockabilly genius, one of the founding architects of rock and roll, who in 1955 wrote and recorded a song about a pair of blue suede shoes that should have made him the biggest star in the world. But at the very moment of his breakthrough, a terrible car accident sidelined him for months, and as he lay recovering, a young singer named Elvis Presley recorded his song and took the stardom that might have been his. Perkins spent the rest of his long career as a deeply respected musician's musician, beloved by the Beatles and by every rocker who knew their history, but never again the star he might have been. He was one of the small handful of young men who, in a Memphis studio in the mid-1950s, quite literally invented rock and roll, and his own composition about a treasured pair of blue suede shoes was among the first records ever to top the country, rhythm and blues, and pop charts all at once. A triumph that should have crowned him the king of the new music. But at the very moment of that breakthrough, as he traveled north for a national television appearance that would have sealed his stardom, a horrific car crash left him hospitalized for months, and while he lay broken in his bed, a young Elvis Presley recorded his song and wrote it to the immortality that might have been his own. He recovered, and worked on for 4 more decades as one of the most respected and beloved figures in music. A hero to the Beatles and to every rocker who knew the history, but the mainstream superstardom slipped forever from his grasp, and he became rock and roll's great might have been. He bore his strange fate with remarkable grace, never bitter that the song he wrote had made another man a legend, content in the deep respect of his fellow musicians and the knowledge that he had been present at the creation of something that changed the world. Speak his name, then, and remember the humble Tennessee genius who wrote one of the founding anthems of rock and roll, who lost the stardom it should have brought him to a hospital bed and a twist of fate, and who lies now in the Tennessee soil, a king remembered by those who know, in the long shadow of the crown he made for another. When he died in 1998, the tributes poured in from the giants who had never forgotten what they owed him, and George Harrison himself sang at his funeral. A fitting honor for a man whose songs had shaped the Beatles. To stand at his grave in Jackson is to remember the quiet, gracious genius who helped invent rock and roll and gave its first great anthem away to history, content to be a hero to those who truly understood the music. His hometown honored him with a museum and a civic center bearing his name, a local pride that stands in gentle contrast to how thoroughly the wider world has forgotten the man who wrote its founding anthem. He rests here now, the rockabilly king who wrote the crown that another man would wear. Let us travel now to the West Lawn Cemetery in Detroit, to the grave of Jackie Wilson, one of the most electrifying performers who ever lived, whose end was almost unbearably cruel. Wilson was a dynamo, a singer of astonishing range and power, and a stage performer of such athletic brilliance that they called him Mr. Excitement, the idol of millions and a direct inspiration to a generation of soul and rock legends. But his career faded through the 1970s, and then, in 1975, while performing on stage, he suffered a massive heart attack, collapsing before the audience and falling into a coma from which he never truly recovered. He lingered, tragically incapacitated, for nearly 9 years before dying, and he was laid in an unmarked grave, where he lay for years until fans raised the money to give Mr. Excitement a headstone at last. He was, quite simply, one of the greatest performers who ever lived. A singer blessed with a soaring, operatic 4-octave voice and an acrobatic, athletic stage presence so thrilling that he earned the nickname Mr. Excitement and inspired the young Elvis Presley, the young James Brown, and a whole generation of soul and rock legends who studied his every move. For years he was a genuine superstar, a matinee idol whose records and live performances drove audiences into a frenzy. But his career cooled through the 1970s, and then came the almost unimaginable cruelty of his end. For while performing on an oldies revue in 1975, at the very moment he sang the words about his heart, he suffered a catastrophic heart attack on stage and struck his head as he fell, sinking into a coma. He lingered in that twilight state, unable to speak or move, for nearly 9 agonizing years before he finally died, penniless, and was buried in an unmarked grave until his heartbroken fans raised the funds to mark it. The manner of his long dying is almost too painful to contemplate. This supremely alive and physical performer trapped for nearly a decade in a silent, motionless twilight, forgotten by an industry that had once worshipped him, his medical bills a burden, and his name slipping from memory even as he lingered. Speak his name then, and remember Mr. Excitement in his glory, the greatest showman of his age, whose 4-octave voice and dazzling moves lit up 1,000 stages, and who fell at last upon one of them, to lie for years in unmarked ground, until the faithful few remembered him. His long, forgotten dying stands as one of the music industry's great shames, a titan left to waste away in near anonymity, while the stars he had inspired filled arenas, and the belated headstone his fans provided is a rebuke to all who let him be forgotten. To stand at his Detroit grave is to remember Mr. Excitement in full flight, the most thrilling performer of his generation, and to mourn the cruelty of the silence that swallowed him. Speak his name then, and remember the impossible voice and the dazzling acrobatic grace of the greatest showman of his age, brought so low at the end that the world had to be shamed into marking his grave. He rests here now, the electrifying idol who fell silent upon the stage he ruled. Let us travel now to the Mount Lawn Cemetery in Sharon Hill, near Philadelphia, to the grave of Tammy Terrell, whose luminous talent was stolen away with heartbreaking swiftness. Terrell was a radiant young singer, the beloved duet partner of Marvin Gaye, and together their voices created some of the most joyful and romantic records in the entire Motown catalog, songs of such warmth that they still make listeners smile decades later. She was young, beautiful, and adored, at the very beginning of a glorious career. But she began to suffer terrible headaches and collapsed one night in Gaye's arms on stage and was found to have a brain tumor. And after a long and agonizing series of operations, she died in 1970, at just 24 years old. Marvin Gaye was so devastated that he could barely perform for years. She was one of the most gifted and beloved of all the young Motown stars, a warm and radiant presence with a voice made for romance, and her series of duets with Marvin Gaye produced some of the most tender and joyful records the label ever released, songs so full of warmth and chemistry that listeners assumed the two must be in love. She was beautiful, talented, and adored, seemingly destined for a long and brilliant career. But she had begun to suffer from severe headaches, and one terrible night in 1967, she collapsed into Marvin Gaye's arms in the middle of a performance, and doctors discovered a malignant brain tumor. There followed nearly 3 years of agonizing operations and decline, and she died in the spring of 1970 at just 24 years old, her glorious voice stilled almost before it had begun. Marvin Gaye was so shattered by her loss that he withdrew from live performance for years, haunted by the memory of the girl who had sung so sweetly beside him. The joy those duets still bring is inseparable now from the sorrow of how briefly she was here. A young woman of such warmth and promise stolen away just as the world was falling in love with her voice. Speak her name, then, and remember the radiant girl whose singing made a nation smile, whose collapse into her partner's arms was the first sign of the illness that would take her at 24, and who lies now near Philadelphia, her 100 love songs still playing, forever young, forever sweet. The grief of her loss echoed through Motown for years, and Marvin Gaye never fully recovered from it, her memory haunting his greatest work. To stand at her grave near Philadelphia is to remember the radiant young woman whose voice made joy sound effortless, and to feel the ache of everything she never got to sing, a career of glory foreclosed by illness before she had even turned 25. Speak her name, then, and remember the radiant girl whose duets still make the world smile, taken by illness before she had even turned 25. She rests here now, the radiant voice of 100 love songs, gone at 24. Let us travel now to the Detroit Memorial Park in Warren, Michigan, to the grave of Florence Ballard, a founding member of the most successful female group in history, who died in poverty and obscurity. Ballard was one of the original 3 voices of the Supremes, the Motown superstars, whose string of #1 hits made them global icons, and for a few dazzling years, she stood at the very summit of popular music. But she was pushed out of the group at the height of its fame, and her attempts at a solo career failed, and she descended into a nightmare of alcoholism, depression, and grinding poverty, at one point surviving on welfare with her children. She was just 32, in the midst of a hopeful comeback, when her heart gave out. Her funeral drew thousands, but the fame and fortune she had helped create had long since passed her by. She had one of the strongest and most soulful voices of the 3 young women who founded the group that would become the most successful female act in the history of popular music. And for a few dazzling years, she rode with them to the very summit, a string of #1 hits, television appearances, glamour, and fame beyond anything 3 girls from a Detroit housing project could have dreamed. But she was gradually pushed aside as another member was elevated to the spotlight, and finally forced out of the group entirely at the height of its success, and her subsequent solo career collapsed. What followed was a long and heartbreaking descent, through failed lawsuits and lost fortunes into alcoholism, depression, and finally genuine poverty, the founding star of a musical empire surviving on public assistance in a modest Detroit home. She was only 32, and reportedly attempting a comeback, when her heart failed. Thousands came to mourn her, but the wealth and glory she had helped to create had long since flowed to others. Hers is among the most bitter of all the stories on this road, a founding member of a musical empire dying on welfare in her early 30s, while the fortune she had helped create flowed to others. A cautionary tale of how cruelly the machinery of fame can discard even those who built it. Speak her name, then, and remember the strong, soulful voice that helped launch the most successful female group in history. The girl from the Detroit projects who touched the summit and then fell all the way back down, and who lies now in Michigan soil, poor in death in the shadow of the glory she gave the world. In death, she received a measure of the recognition denied her in life, honored at last as a founding member of an immortal group, but the honors could not undo the years of hardship or return the fortune that had slipped through her fingers. To stand at her grave in Michigan is to remember the strong, soulful voice of a founding supreme, and to feel the bitter injustice of a builder of empires left to die in poverty. Speak her name, then, and remember the strong, soulful voice of a founding supreme, and the bitter road that carried her from the summit of the charts to a welfare line and an early grave. She rests here now, the founding supreme who died poor in the shadow of the empire she built. Let us travel now to the Forest Lawn Memorial Park in the Hollywood Hills, to the grave of Mary Wells, once crowned the Queen of Motown, who ended her days in heartbreaking hardship. Wells was Motown's first true superstar, the sweet-voiced singer whose signature song was one of the label's earliest and biggest hits, a #1 record that made her a household name, and the reigning queen of the young Motown sound. But she made the fateful decision to leave the label at the peak of her fame, and her career never recovered, drifting through smaller and smaller labels as the hits stopped coming. Decades later, stricken with throat cancer and unable to afford her care, the woman whose voice had once defined an era was left nearly destitute, her medical bills paid at the end by fellow musicians who remembered what she had been. She died in 1992. She was the very first superstar the young Motown label ever produced, the sweet, girlish voice behind a string of early hits that helped put the company on the map, culminating in a chart-topping classic written just for her that became one of the defining songs of the era and earned her the title of the Queen of Motown. She was still only in her early 20s, seemingly with the world at her feet. But lured by promises of greater riches elsewhere, she made the fateful choice to leave the label at the very peak of her fame, and it proved a catastrophic mistake, for the hits stopped almost at once, and her career drifted downward through a succession of ever smaller labels over the decades that followed. By the end of her life, she was stricken with cancer of the throat, the very source of her gift, and so short of money that she could not afford her treatment, and it fell to a group of fellow musicians to pay her medical bills before she died. The Queen of Motown left this world with almost nothing. That the very voice that had made her famous should be the thing cancer stole from her, and that she should die without the means to fight it, is a cruelty almost too neat to bear, a queen reduced to depending on the charity of those who remembered her reign. Speak her name then, and remember the sweet, girlish voice that gave Motown its first superstar, the woman crowned its queen who gambled her crown and lost, and who lies now in the Hollywood Hills, her signature song of devotion still playing while the world forgot the woman who sang it. The musicians who paid her final bills did so out of love and respect for what she had meant to the music, a quiet act of grace at the end of a hard road. To stand at her grave in the Hollywood Hills is to remember the sweet voice that gave Motown its first taste of stardom, and to mourn a queen who reigned too briefly and fell too far, undone by a single fateful choice at the height of her fame. Her signature song remains one of the most beloved records the label ever produced, still instantly recognizable, though the woman who sang it has faded almost entirely from public memory. She rests here now, the Queen of Motown, whose crown could not pay her way home. Let us travel now to the Heavenly Gate Cemetery in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, to the grave of Percy Sledge, whose single towering song is one of the most beloved records ever made. Sledge was a former hospital orderly from Alabama when, in 1966, he poured all his aching heart into a slow, soaring ballad about the depths a man will sink to for love, and the result was a monumental #1 hit that has never left the airwaves, a song played at countless weddings and slow dances for generations since. But though he recorded for decades afterward and remained a beloved live performer, he never again came close to that one transcendent moment, forever known as the man who sang that one immortal song. When he died in 2015, the song was as alive as ever, but the gentle man who sang it slipped quietly away. He was working as an orderly in an Alabama hospital, singing on weekends to make a little extra money, when he took a melody a couple of friends had been playing with and poured into it all the heartbreak of his own recent romantic troubles, and the result was one of the most perfect and enduring soul ballads ever recorded, a slow, aching, gospel-drenched declaration of a man's total devotion that shot straight to the top of the charts in 1966 and has never left the world's airwaves since. It is played at weddings and funerals and on late-night radio to this very day, one of the most beloved records ever made. But lightning of that kind rarely strikes twice, and though he recorded steadily for decades afterward and remained a warm and gracious live performer touring the world, he never again found a song to match it, and he became, in the public mind, the man who sang that one immortal song and little else. When he died in 2015, the song played on, as beloved as ever, while the gentle man who gave it to us slipped quietly from view. There are worse fates than to be remembered for a single song, especially a song as perfect and as immortal as his, played tenderly at the most important moments of countless strangers' lives, and he seemed to understand and accept that his one great gift to the world was enough. Speak his name then, and remember the Alabama hospital orderly who reached, just once, for something transcendent and caught it, whose slow, aching ballad of devotion has soundtracked half a century of love, and who lies now in Louisiana soil, the man behind the song that will surely never die. He carried his one-hit fame with a rare and gentle dignity, grateful rather than bitter, touring the world for decades as the beloved bearer of a song that meant so much to so many. To stand at his grave in Baton Rouge is to remember the hospital orderly who reached the heights just once and reached them higher than almost anyone, leaving the world a ballad of devotion that will be sung as long as men and women fall in love. Speak his name then, and let that slow, aching melody rise once more in memory. The sound of a man laying his whole heart bare, a gift so perfect that it has outlived his fame and will surely outlive us all. He rests here now, the soul singer whose one great song still breaks hearts everywhere. Let us travel now to the Forest Lawn Cemetery in Buffalo, New York, to the grave of Rick James, the flamboyant funk superstar whose wild life burned him out too soon. James was a genuine phenomenon, the self-proclaimed king of punk funk whose outrageous style and irresistible grooves produced one of the most instantly recognizable dance hits of the 1980s, a song so infectious it has never stopped being played. For a few years, he was one of the biggest and most electrifying stars in music. But years of hard living and excess took a merciless toll on his health and his career, and after a period of serious legal and personal troubles, he faded from the spotlight, enjoying a brief revival as a pop culture punchline shortly before his death in 2004. He was one of the most flamboyant and commercially explosive stars of his era, a swaggering showman who fused funk and rock and pop into an irresistible sound he called punk funk, and whose biggest hit, a leering, unforgettable dance floor anthem, became one of the most instantly recognizable records of the 1980s, and was later sampled into a whole second life for a new generation. For a few years, he was everywhere, a genuine superstar with a string of hits and a larger-than-life persona. But his appetite for the excesses of fame was enormous, and years of hard living wrecked his health, while serious legal troubles and a stint behind bars derailed his career and his reputation. He enjoyed one last, strange burst of fame as the punchline of a wildly popular comedy sketch shortly before his death, a bittersweet coda, and then his ravaged heart and body gave out in 2004, taking one of funk's most electrifying and self-destructive talents. His was a fame that burned at both ends, a dazzling talent yoked to a self-destruction just as fierce, so that the same appetite that fueled his electrifying stardom also consumed it, and him, with terrible speed. Speak his name, then, and remember the flamboyant king of punk funk in his brief, blazing prime, the irresistible groove that still fills dance floors decades on, and the hard, fast, troubled life that ended too soon, leaving him in a Buffalo grave where fans still leave their bottles in tribute to a super freak. A new generation discovered his groove through the samples and tributes that followed his death, keeping his sound alive on dance floors he would never see. To stand at his grave in Buffalo is to remember the flamboyant, self-destructive genius of punk funk in his blazing prime, and to feel the old, familiar sorrow of a talent that burned so hot it could not last, gone at 56 with the party still raging in his wake. He rests here now, the king of funk whose super freak groove still shakes the world he left. And so we come to the final grave of this first part of our journey, and it belongs to one of the most beloved voices of the 1960s, a woman whose warmth the whole world adored. Let us travel to the Mount Sinai Memorial Park in Los Angeles, to the grave of Cass Elliot, the glorious Mama Cass. Elliot was the beating heart of one of the great harmony groups of the decade, her huge, joyful, soaring voice lifting a string of sunshine-drenched classics, and her irrepressible warmth and humor made her one of the most loved figures of her generation. A solo star and television favorite after the group disbanded. But she struggled all her life with her weight and with the cruel mockery it drew, and in 1974, in London, on the very cusp of a triumphant comeback, her heart simply gave out, and she died at just 32. A cruel and false rumor about the manner of her death followed her for decades, a final unkindness to a woman who had given the world so much joy. She was the great, glorious, beating heart of one of the defining groups of the 1960s, a woman of enormous talent and even more enormous personality whose rich, the soaring voice anchored a string of shimmering harmony classics that still sound like pure sunshine and whose wit and warmth made her one of the most beloved figures of her generation. A natural television star who went on to a successful solo career and her own variety specials. But for all her outward joy, she suffered greatly, tormented her whole life by her weight and by the casual cruelty the world directed at large women, mockery that wounded her deeply despite her brave good humor. In the summer of 1974, performing to acclaim in London, and seemingly on the verge of a whole new chapter, she died suddenly in her sleep of heart failure at just 32. And then came a final, baseless indignity, a cruel and false rumor about the manner of her death that clung to her memory for decades, a last unkindness to a woman who had asked for nothing but to bring the world a little joy. That so much joy should have masked so much private pain, and that even her death could not escape a final cruel mockery, is among the saddest ironies on our whole journey, for she gave the world nothing but warmth and asked so little in return. Speak her name then, and remember the glorious, laughing mama whose voice was pure sunshine, the beloved heart of a golden era group, wounded all her life by cruelty about her body and taken by her failing heart at just 32, and lying now in Los Angeles, her shimmering harmonies still warming the world she left too soon. In time, the false rumor about her death was thoroughly debunked, but not before it had done its damage, a reminder of how casually the world treated a woman who had given it so much delight. To stand at her grave in Los Angeles is to remember the glorious mama in full voice, the sunshine and the harmony and the irrepressible warmth, and to mourn a heart, in every sense, too big for this world, stilled at just 32. Speak her name then, one more time, and let the sunshine of her voice fill the quiet of this place. For of all the faded stars we have visited tonight, few gave the world more pure and generous joy than she, and few deserve more to be remembered kindly. She rests here now, the joyful mama whose sunshine voice was dimmed too soon. And so, friends, we pause here, among these first 15, and let the silence of the cemetery settle over us. 15 songs we have heard again tonight in memory. 15 voices that once filled the world and then fell quiet, and at every grave the same heartbreak has met us, the cruelty of a fame that gives everything and then takes it all away, leaving so many of these gifted souls to die young, or poor, or forgotten, in graves the world could not trouble itself to visit, and yet the songs remain, do they not? That is the strange grace of it. That long after the singer is gone, and the name is forgotten, the song plays on some late-night radio station, or some old scratched record, giving joy to people who will never know the price that was paid to make it. 15 more of these dear, faded voices wait for us a little further on, more one-hit wonders and forgotten stars with heartbreaking graves of their own, and we shall go and keep them company too. So take my arm once more, and when you are ready, we shall walk on together, and go on remembering the ones who gave us a song, and then were gone. They come from every corner of American music, these 15, from soul and country and rock and roll and the blues, but they share the same quiet fate, a fame that flared and faded and left them resting, at last, in graves the world rarely troubles to find. Let us travel now to the Saints Peter and Paul Cemetery near Philadelphia. Let us travel now to the Saints Peter and Paul Cemetery near Philadelphia, to the grave of Bobby Rydell, one of the great teen idols of the early rock and roll era. Rydell was a genuine sensation, a handsome, talented boy from South Philadelphia who, along with his neighborhood friends, helped define the clean-cut teen idol sound of the late 1950s and early 60s, scoring more than 30 hits with songs like his beloved Shore Anthem and his swinging cover of an Italian favorite. So famous was he that the high school in the musical Grease was named in his honor. But the arrival of the Beatles and the British invasion swept away his whole generation of teen idols almost overnight, and though he continued to perform for devoted fans for the rest of his life, the screaming crowds of his youth were long gone. He died in 2022, a beloved local legend, but a faded national memory. He was, in many respects, the original teen heartthrob, a triple threat who could sing, act, and play the drums, and he emerged from a remarkable little corner of South Philadelphia that produced a whole cluster of teen idols in those years. clean-cut Italian-American boys with big voices and bigger smiles. For a few dazzling seasons, he was everywhere. On the radio and the television dance shows and the movie screen, his shore anthem, The Sound of Summer, for a whole generation of East Coast kids. But the cultural earthquake of the British invasion made his wholesome style seem instantly old-fashioned, and the hits stopped almost overnight. He handled the decline with grace, working the nightclub and nostalgia circuits for decades and even surviving a double organ transplant late in life, forever gracious to the fans who remembered when he had been the biggest thing in America. There is a gentle melancholy in the fate of the teen idol, whose fame is built on youth itself, and so cannot possibly last. And he lived that arc as fully as anyone, adored beyond reason at 19 and a nostalgic memory by 30. Yet he never grew bitter, and to the fans who followed him for 60 years he remained the warm, funny, generous boy from the neighborhood, honored in his city with streets bearing his name. Speak his name, then, and remember the original teen heartthrob, and the summer sound of a vanished America. His fellow South Philadelphia idols would gather with him in later years for nostalgia tours, three old friends singing the hits of their youth to graying audiences who remembered exactly where they had been when those songs first played. And there was a sweetness in that loyalty, a refusal to let the old music die entirely. When he passed in 2022, the tributes came from a city that had never stopped claiming him as its own, even as the wider world had long since changed its channel. Speak his name then, and remember the grinning boy from South Philly who was, for one bright season, the very sound of American summer. To stand at his grave near the city he loved is to remember a whole vanished world of sock hops and transistor radios and screaming girls, a first flowering of rock and roll that felt, for a moment, as though it would last forever, and then was gone. Speak his name, and let that summertime shore anthem play one more time. He rests here now, the teen idol whose Wild Ones and Wildwood days have drifted into the past. Let us travel now to the Roselawn Memorial Gardens in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, to the grave of Ray Peterson, a gifted singer forever tied to one heartbreaking song. Peterson possessed a remarkable 4-octave voice, and though he charted several hits, he is remembered above all for a teenage tragedy ballad about a boy who dies in a race car trying to win money to buy his sweetheart a wedding ring, a melodrama so intense that one British label destroyed thousands of copies, deeming it too morbid to release. It was a huge hit all the same. He also recorded the original version of a song that would later become a signature for Elvis Presley, but his own fame faded quickly, and he spent his later years songwriting and playing the occasional show for the faithful. He died of cancer in 2005. His was a genuinely extraordinary instrument, capable of leaping across 4 octaves, and in a fairer world he might be remembered as one of the great voices of his era, rather than as the man behind a single melodramatic hit. That hit, a lurid little tale of teenage death and devotion, was so controversial in its day that a British record company destroyed some 20,000 copies rather than release something it considered ghoulish, though the song became a smash regardless. He recorded the first version of a ballad that Elvis Presley would later make his own, and he founded his own record label. But the momentum of his career soon faded. He spent his last decades quietly, writing songs and occasionally singing for the fans who still remembered, before cancer took him. It is a strange kind of immortality, to be remembered for a single morbid ballad, while a genuinely astonishing voice is forgotten. But such is the arithmetic of pop music, which keeps the song and discards the singer. He deserved better, and those who know his fuller catalog mourn how completely the rest of it has vanished. Speak his name then, and remember the 4-octave marvel behind that one immortal teenage tragedy, laid to rest in the Tennessee soil far from the spotlight. He belonged to a whole vanished genre of the early 60s, the teenage tragedy song, a peculiar and morbid little corner of pop in which young lovers perished in crashes and the singer wept over their memory. And of all those doomed ballads, his remains among the most fondly, if guiltily, remembered. He asked little of the world in his later years, content to have had his moment, and the world in turn let his greater gifts slip quietly into obscurity. Speak his name then, and remember the astonishing 4-octave voice the world reduced to a single mournful ballad. To stand at his grave in Tennessee is to feel the quiet unfairness of a great instrument remembered for a single novelty, a singer who could have been so much more, laid to rest far from any spotlight. His records still surface on oldies collections of doomed teenage love, a genre that says something poignant about how that generation romanced its own fears of death and loss. Speak his name and let the old tragedy play once more. He had shaved a few years off his age for the sake of publicity, a small vanity in a business built on youth, so that even his tombstone's arithmetic carried a whisper of showmanship. He rests here now, the four-octave voice behind one unforgettable teenage tragedy. Let us travel now to the Center Cemetery in Somers, Connecticut, to the grave of Gene Pitney, one of the most successful and dramatic singers of the 1960s. Pitney had a soaring, emotional, instantly recognizable voice, and he poured it into a string of grand, cinematic hits, songs of heartbreak and longing that made him a superstar on both sides of the Atlantic, and especially beloved in Britain. He was also a gifted songwriter who penned major hits for other stars before his own career took off. But as musical tastes shifted, his brand of operatic pop fell out of fashion in America, though he continued to tour triumphantly in Europe for decades. He died in 2006, alone in his hotel room in Wales, the morning after what fans called one of the finest concerts of his life. He was a singer of rare intensity, his trembling, passionate tenor perfectly suited to the grand, doom-laden melodramas that were his specialty, songs of pity and heartbreak and lonely gunfighters that made him a genuine superstar, particularly in Britain, where his popularity endured for decades after it had faded at home. He was also a gifted songwriter who had handed hit songs to other artists before he ever stepped to the microphone himself. But American tastes moved on from his operatic style, and he made his living in his later years, touring the theaters of Europe, adored by audiences who never forgot. It was after one such triumphant show in Wales, a performance his fans called among his finest, that he was found dead in his hotel bed the next morning. His great dramatic voice stilled at 66. There is something almost operatic in the way he died. The great melodramatist of pop taking his final bow the night before, then slipping away in his sleep after what everyone agreed was a triumphant performance, as though he had written the ending himself. In Britain, they never forgot him. In America, they largely did. Speak his name then, and remember the trembling, passionate voice that made heartbreak sound like grand opera, gone the morning after the curtain fell. He remained, to the end, a bigger star abroad than at home, a curious fate that he bore with good humor, crossing the ocean year after year to sing his old dramatic hits for European audiences who treated him as the legend he was. That his last night on earth should have been one of triumph, a beloved performer taking his bows before adoring fans, is perhaps the kindest thing that can be said of so sudden an ending. Speak his name, then, and remember the trembling, operatic voice that made every heartbreak sound like the end of the world. To stand at his grave in the little Connecticut town he called home is to remember the roar of the European crowds that never stopped loving him, even as his own country quietly moved on. He had handed a future star one of his own compositions early on, a reminder that his gifts as a writer nearly matched his gifts as a singer. Speak his name and let that grand old heartbreak swell again. He rests here now, the dramatic voice of a town without pity, gone the morning after his final song. Let us travel now to the Pacific View Memorial Park in Corona del Mar, California, to the grave of Bobby Hatfield, one half of the incomparable Righteous Brothers. Hatfield possessed a soaring, aching tenor, and it was his voice, singing alone, that carried one of the most beautiful and enduring recordings in all of popular music, a tremulous ballad of yearning that has moved listeners for generations. Together with his partner, he pioneered the sound known as blue-eyed soul and produced a string of monumental hits. But the duo's greatest fame was behind them by the 1970s, and though they reunited and toured for years, on a November night in 2003, Hatfield was found dead in his hotel room, just half an hour before he was due to take the stage. His voice was a thing of aching, tremulous beauty, and it was his solo performance, not the duo's, on a certain yearning ballad of loneliness and longing that became one of the most beloved and most played recordings in the history of popular music, revived again and again for new generations by films and television. Together with his baritone partner, he had virtually invented the sound critics dubbed blue-eyed soul, and their run of towering hits in the mid-60s made them legends. But their peak was brief, and the decades that followed were quieter, a long life on the nostalgia circuit. On a November evening in 2003, when he failed to appear for a concert, someone was sent to his hotel room and found that his heart had given out just half an hour before showtime, a performer to the very end. To hear that famous ballad even now, that impossibly tender, soaring plea, is to marvel that a single human voice could contain so much longing. And it is that voice, more than any biography, that is his true and lasting memorial. That he should die alone in a hotel room, minutes from a stage he had graced for 40 years, feels almost unbearably poignant. Speak his name then, and remember the aching tenor behind one of the most beautiful recordings ever made, a melody that will never be forgotten even as the man who sang it fades. He lies in a beautiful hillside cemetery not far from far more famous graves, and few of the visitors who come there to see the resting places of movie stars and athletes pause at the marker of the man whose voice they have surely heard 1,000 times without knowing his name. That is the peculiar anonymity of the great voice attached to a forgotten face. Speak his name then, and remember the aching solo tenor behind one of the most beautiful recordings ever made by anyone. To stand at his grave in the California hills is to marvel that so famous a voice should rest so anonymously, passed each day by visitors seeking louder names. His partner would go on performing under the old name with a new voice, but the particular magic of that solo ballad could never be replaced. Speak his name and let that aching melody rise once more. He rests here now, the soaring tenor whose unchained melody still aches across the years. Let us travel now to a cemetery in Hackensack, New Jersey, to the grave of Ben E. King, whose single immortal anthem is one of the most beloved songs ever written. King first found fame as the velvet-voiced lead singer of the Drifters, before launching a solo career and recording a tender plea for loyalty and companionship that became an eternal standard, covered hundreds of times, and beloved around the world, its fame renewed decades later by a hit film that took its name. He charted many other hits, but that one song towered above them all. And though the song is immortal, the gentleman who sang it faded quietly from public view, still performing for those who remembered, but no longer a star. He died of natural causes in 2015. He had one of the smoothest and most soulful voices of his generation. First as the lead singer who lifted the Drifters to some of their greatest heights, and then on his own, when he took a simple gospel melody and a lyric about needing someone to stand beside him in the dark and turned it into one of the most perfect and enduring songs ever recorded. It has been sung at weddings and funerals and civil rights marches, covered by hundreds of artists, and voted one of the great songs of the century. He had other hits, but that one belonged to the ages. And yet the gentle, unassuming man who sang it was no household name in his later years, touring modestly for those who knew, dying quietly of natural causes in his New Jersey hometown. The song far more famous than the singer. There are few songs in all the world as universally loved as the one he gave us. A song of such simple, perfect comfort, that it has become a kind of secular hymn, sung wherever human beings need to remind one another that they are not alone. He carried the quiet dignity of a man who knew he had given the world something lasting and asked for nothing more. Speak his name then, and remember the gentle soul who took a simple melody and made of it an eternal promise, and who slipped away as modestly as he had lived. He wrote that immortal song, in part, as a tribute to his own wife, a small private devotion that grew into a universal anthem of human solidarity. And there is something fitting in that so personal a feeling should become so widely shared. More than 600 people filled a church to bid him farewell. But in the years since, his grave, like so many on this journey, has grown quiet, visited far less than the song is sung. Speak his name then, and remember the gentle drifter who gave the whole world its simplest and truest anthem of comfort. To stand at his grave in New Jersey is to hear, in memory, that simple, perfect melody, and to understand that some songs become so beloved they nearly swallow the men who made them. He had climbed from doo-wop street corners to the top of the charts, and back down again to quiet dignity, carrying his one great gift the whole way. Speak his name, and let that gentle promise sound again. He had lent his voice, over the years, to session dates and other singers' records, without ever seeking the spotlight. A quiet craftsman, as much as a star. He rests here now, the tender voice that asked only that we stand by him. Let us travel now to the Evergreen Cemetery in Louisville, Kentucky, to the grave of Wilson Pickett, one of the most electrifying soul singers who ever lived. Pickett was a force of nature, a raw, ferocious performer whose gospel-fired shouts drove a string of monumental soul classics, anthems of the midnight hour, and the open road that defined the sound of the 1960s. and still fill dance floors today. He was known as the Wicked Picket for the sheer intensity of his music and his temperament. But the soul era faded, and his later years were troubled by legal and personal difficulties. And by the time he died in 2006, he had drifted far from the spotlight, laid to rest in a Louisville mausoleum that one writer called the city's most overlooked grave. He was one of the most ferocious and thrilling performers soul music ever produced. A singer who attacked a song with the raw, shouting intensity of the gospel church, and across the mid-1960s he unleashed a torrent of classics, anthems of the midnight hour and dance floors and open highways that became the very bloodstream of soul music and have never stopped being played. His temper and his intensity earned him a fearsome nickname. But the soul era faded, and his later decades were shadowed by legal troubles and personal turmoil, his once mighty career reduced to a shadow. When he died in 2006, he was laid to rest in a Louisville mausoleum beside his mother, in a grave one writer movingly called the most overlooked in the whole city, the wicked genius largely forgotten by the world he had once set on fire. His records are the very definition of soul music at its rawest and most thrilling, and no party or dance floor has ever quite been able to resist them, so that his sound remains vividly alive even as his name and his story slip from memory. The overlooked grave beside his mother's is a quiet resting place for so loud and so mighty a talent. Speak his name, then, and remember the wicked, ferocious genius who sang the midnight hour into immortality, and who lies now nearly forgotten in a Louisville mausoleum. He came up through the hardest school of Southern soul, singing gospel before he ever sang for the world, and that church fire never left his voice, which could turn a simple dance number into something like a religious experience. The troubles of his later life could not erase what he had built in his prime, though they did leave him, at the end, far poorer in fame than he deserved. Speak his name then, and remember the ferocious, gospel-fired shouter who set the dance floors of the world alight. To stand at his overlooked grave in Louisville, beside his mother, is to feel how carelessly the world discards even its most electrifying talents once the fashion has passed. His songs remain staples of wedding bands and cover bands the world over, played nightly by people who have no idea whose genius they are borrowing. Speak his name and let that fierce old groove kick up once more. He rests here now, the wicked soul shouter whose midnight hour has quietly passed. Let us travel now to a humble country cemetery called Mulatto Bend, near Port Allen, Louisiana, to the grave of Slim Harpo, the master of the swamp blues. Harpo was a Louisiana original, a harmonica player and singer with a lazy, hypnotic drawl who recorded a handful of blues classics so infectious that a young English band called the Rolling Stones covered one of them on their very first album, spreading his sound around the world. Yet he never made enough money from music to quit his day job hauling freight, and he remained a working man to the end. He died of a sudden heart attack in 1970, at just 45. Before the blues revival could bring him the fame he deserved, and he was buried in a small, hard-to-find graveyard between the fields, his stone, they say, sometimes decorated by fans with harmonicas. He was the master of a lazy, humid, hypnotic style of blues that grew straight out of the Louisiana Bayou country, singing in an unhurried drawl over grooves so infectious that the young British bands of the 60s fell in love with them, and the Rolling Stones chose one of his songs to record on their very first album, carrying his sound to the whole world. Yet for all that influence, the fame never translated into fortune, and he worked a day job hauling freight in his own trucking business right to the end, a bluesman who never got to be a full-time star. A sudden heart attack took him in 1970, at just 45, on the very eve of the blues revival that might finally have rewarded him, and he was buried in a tiny, hard-to-find country graveyard wedged between the fields he had known all his life. His influence far outran his fame, seeping into the sound of the British invasion and beyond, so that millions who have never heard his name have heard his songs through the bands who worshipped him. That so influential an artist should have died, a working truck driver, buried in an obscure country graveyard between the fields, is one of the quiet injustices of the blues. Speak his name, then, and remember the master of the swamp blues, whose lazy, hypnotic drawl still buzzes through the music of the world, laid to rest in the humble Louisiana ground he never left. He recorded for a small Louisiana label and pressed his hypnotic grooves onto records that traveled improbably far, across an ocean and into the hands of English teenagers who would build the sound of a decade on foundations men like him had laid. He never saw a dime of that influence, working his freight routes by day and playing the bars by night, a bluesman to his bones. Speak his name, then, and remember the swamp blues master whose lazy drawl the Rolling Stones themselves carried around the world. To stand in that little cemetery between the cane fields, searching among the humble stones for his, is to understand the whole heartbreaking distance between influence and reward in the blues. Speak his name and let that lazy harmonica drawl drift over the fields again. He rests here now, the king bee of the swamp blues, laid to rest between the Louisiana fields. Let us travel now to the Woodlawn Cemetery in Detroit, to the grave of Levi Stubbs, the thunderous voice of the Four Tops. Stubbs was one of the great male voices of the Motown era, a singer of enormous power and urgency whose desperate, pleading delivery drove some of the most beloved records the label ever produced, anthems of devotion and heartbreak that have never left the airwaves. Uniquely among the great Motown lead singers, he never once left his group to go solo, remaining loyal to his three fellow tops for decades out of loyalty and love. In his later years, he even lent his mighty voice to a man-eating plant in a beloved movie musical. But illness silenced him at last, and the powerhouse voice of 100 classics fell quiet. He had one of the most powerful and emotionally urgent voices in the entire Motown stable, a big, pleading, almost desperate baritone that turned a series of the label's finest records into towering monuments of longing and devotion, songs that still send a charge through anyone who hears them. What set him apart from the other great Motown lead singers was his fierce loyalty, for while the others were lured away one by one to chase solo stardom, he refused every offer and stayed with his three fellow group members for more than 4 decades, unwilling to break up a brotherhood. Late in life, he even lent his booming voice to a memorable role in a movie musical, but strokes and cancer gradually silenced that great instrument, and he died at last in 2008. The mightiest and most faithful of Motown's voices at rest. His refusal to leave his group for solo glory, in an era when every star was chasing it, speaks to a loyalty and a decency rare in any business, and it may have cost him the individual fame his talent deserved, though it never dimmed the power of the records he made. Those records still stop listeners in their tracks with their urgency and heart. Speak his name then, and remember the thunderous, pleading voice of the Four Tops, the most faithful of Motown's giants who reached out across the years to every one of us. He was, by every account, as decent a man as he was, a powerful singer, devoted to his group and his family and his city, and the loyalty that kept him from solo stardom was of a piece with the whole character of the man. When the Strokes came and stole his voice, the silence was a grief to everyone who had thrilled to that mighty sound. Speak his name then, and remember the mighty, faithful voice of the Four Tops who never once abandoned his brothers. To stand at his grave in Detroit, among so many of his fellow Motown giants, is to remember a voice that could shake the walls, and a loyalty that never wavered. His records remain a masterclass in emotional urgency, the sound of a man singing as though his very life depended on being heard. Speak his name and let that mighty voice reach out once more. He rests here now, the thunderous, loyal voice who reached out to us all. Let us travel now, elsewhere in that same Detroit cemetery, to the grave of David Ruffin, the tortured genius of the Temptations. Ruffin possessed one of the most distinctive voices in all of soul, a raspy, anguished, unforgettable tenor that sang lead on some of the most beloved records ever made, including a certain sunny declaration of love that remains one of the most famous songs in American history. He was a mesmerizing star. But his ego and his appetites tore him from the group at the height of its fame, and though he scored solo hits, his life spiraled into decades of addiction and turmoil, ending in a Philadelphia rooming house in 1991. A fellow superstar quietly paid for his funeral. His voice was one of the miracles of soul music, a raspy, urgent, aching tenor that could break your heart in a single phrase, and as a lead singer of the Temptations during their greatest years, he sang the leads on some of the most beloved records ever made, including a sunlit declaration of devotion that may be one of the most famous songs America has ever produced. He was a magnetic, electrifying star, but his enormous ego and his growing appetite for drugs pulled him out of the group at the height of its glory. And though he found some solo success, the rest of his life was a long, sad war with addiction, ending in a Philadelphia rooming house at just 50. A fellow superstar, moved by what he had been, quietly paid for his funeral, a last kindness for a man whose gifts had brought him so little peace. The cruel irony of his life was that a man who sang so gloriously of love and sunshine found so little of either peace or happiness for himself, his extraordinary gifts forever at war with the demons that finally destroyed him. And yet the voice endures, that raspy, aching, unmistakable sound, on records that will be loved as long as anyone loves soul music. Speak his name then, and remember the tortured genius who sang one of the sunniest songs ever made, and who lies now among his fellow Motown legends in the Detroit ground. His fall was as steep as his rise had been dazzling, a cautionary tale as old as fame itself, and yet no cautionary tale can diminish the sheer beauty of what he left behind. The leads he sang in those golden years that remain untouchable, definitive, eternal. That a fellow star stepped forward to give him a dignified burial says something about how deeply other musicians understood what he had been. Speak his name then, and remember the raspy, aching genius who sang of sunshine and found so little of it himself. To stand at his grave in Detroit is to hold two truths at once, the glory of the records and the tragedy of the life, and to be grateful that the music, at least, endures unscarred. The group he left behind carried on without him, but no replacement ever quite matched the raw ache of that unmistakable lead. Speak his name and let that sunlit song play one more time. He rests here now, the anguished voice of my girl, whose own life knew too little sunshine. Let us travel now to the Forest Lawn Memorial Park in the Hollywood Hills, to the grave of Lou Rawls, the smooth-voiced baritone who was a fixture of American music for decades. Rawls had one of the richest, warmest voices in all of popular music, a supple baritone equally at home in jazz, blues, gospel, and soul. And he used it to sell more than 40 million records, scoring his biggest hit with a lush declaration of undying love. He was also a tireless humanitarian whose annual telethon raised hundreds of millions for education over the years. But as the decades passed, his easy, sophisticated style slipped from fashion. And though he never stopped working, the enormous fame of his prime gradually faded. He died of cancer in 2006. He had a voice like warm honey, one of the richest and most versatile baritones in all of popular music. Equally masterful in blues, jazz, gospel, and soul, and he used it across a career of more than 60 albums and 40 million records sold, scoring his signature hit with a lush and worldly ballad about the impossibility of finding another love as fine. He was as admired for his character as his voice, a tireless humanitarian whose annual telethon raised staggering sums for the education of young people over more than a quarter of a century. But his sophisticated, grown-up style gradually fell out of step with the times, and though he never stopped working and never lost his dignity, the great fame of his prime slowly ebbed away until cancer took him in 2006. He was a model of grace and generosity in a hard business, a man who gave as much through his tireless charity work as through his music, and who wore his enormous success lightly to the end. That so warm and beloved a presence should fade from the wider memory is simply the price, the sophisticated pay when fashion moves on. Speak his name then, and remember the honeyed baritone that sold 40 million records and raised hundreds of millions for the young, the smoothest and most gracious voice of his age. He had begun life on the hard south side of Chicago and survived a car crash so severe it left him in a coma, emerging from it, by his own account, with a deeper and richer voice than before, as though he had been given a second life to sing with. He used that second life generously, for his music and for his causes both. Speak his name then, and remember the honeyed baritone who sold 40 million records and gave so much of himself away. To stand at his grave in the Hollywood Hills is to remember a voice like warm honey and a heart to match, a man who gave the world both beauty and generosity in full measure. His annual telethon became a fixture of American life for decades, so that even those who forgot his records remembered his generosity. Speak his name and let that warm baritone fill the room again. He rests here now, the velvet baritone whose warm and easy sound the world has drifted away from. Let us travel now, elsewhere in this same Hollywood cemetery, to the grave of Tina Marie, the beloved singer known as the Ivory Queen of Soul. Marie was a remarkable talent, a young white woman with a powerhouse voice steeped so deeply in rhythm and blues that many listeners assumed she was black, And under the wing of her mentor and great love Rick James, she became a genuine soul and funk star, adored especially in the black community that embraced her as one of its own. She also struck a landmark blow for artists' rights, winning a legal battle that changed the recording industry. But her heyday faded with the 1980s, and though she enjoyed a late comeback, she died suddenly in her sleep in 2010, at just 54. She was one of the most remarkable talents of her era, a young woman whose voice was so steeped in the sound of black rhythm and blues that listeners who had never seen her simply assumed she was black, and who was embraced with deep and lasting love by the very community whose music she sang. Under the mentorship of her great musical partner and love, the funk superstar Rick James, she became a genuine star of soul and funk, and she also struck a lasting blow for every musician who came after her, winning a landmark lawsuit against her record label that changed the rules of the industry. But her greatest fame belonged to the 1980s, and though a devoted following never left her, and a late comeback cheered her fans, she died suddenly in her sleep in 2010. At just 54, her powerful voice stilled far too early. She broke barriers simply by being herself. A white woman, so wholly at home in black music that she transcended the categories the industry tried to impose, beloved without reservation by the community whose sound she shared, and her landmark legal victory quietly improved the lives of countless artists who would never know her name. Her sudden death at 54 robbed the world of a voice still in its power. Speak her name then, and remember the Ivory Queen of Soul, whose fire and desire lit up a decade before burning out far too soon. Her bond with her mentor and musical soulmate was one of the great creative partnerships of its era, and their electric duet remains a touchstone of 80s soul, two voices entwined in something that sounded a great deal like love. When he died, only months before her, the loss was said to have devastated her. Speak her name then, and remember the Ivory Queen of Soul, embraced without reservation by the community whose music she sang. To stand at her grave in the Hollywood Hills is to remember a voice that leapt across every line the world tried to draw, and a love story that ended, cruelly, only months before her own. A whole generation of younger soul and R&B singers came to cite her as an influence, keeping her flame alive even as the charts forgot her. Speak her name and let that fire and desire blaze once more. She rests here now, the Ivory Queen of Soul whose fire and desire burned out too soon. Let us travel now, still within this same forest lawn, to the grave of Solomon Burke, a towering figure who called himself the King of Rock and Soul. Burke was one of the founding fathers of soul music, a preacher's grandson with a magnificent, gospel-drenched voice who recorded a string of foundational soul classics in the early 1960s, songs that shaped everything that followed, and that were covered by everyone from the Rolling Stones to countless others. He was a larger-than-life character, a bishop with a huge family who sometimes sold sandwiches and popcorn to his own concert audiences. But his fame faded as the soul era waned, and though a late career renaissance won him a Grammy and new respect, he died suddenly in an Amsterdam airport in 2010, still on the road at 70. He was one of the true architects of soul music, a man raised in the church who brought the full fervor of the pulpit to popular song, and in the early 1960s he recorded a run of foundational classics, pleading, gospel-soaked masterpieces that shaped the entire genre and were seized upon and covered by admirers from the Rolling Stones on down. He was a gloriously larger-than-life figure, a bishop with more than 20 children who was known, in his leaner years, to sell sandwiches and popcorn to the very crowds who came to hear him sing. His fame faded with the soul era, but a remarkable late-life renaissance brought him a Grammy and a whole new generation of admirers before he died suddenly in an Amsterdam airport in 2010, 70 years old and still, gloriously, on the road. He was one of the genuine founding fathers of soul, a man whose early records laid the very foundations of the genre, and his glorious late-career comeback proved that the magnificent, gospel-trained voice had never left him, even as the world had briefly looked away. He died as he had lived, on the road, still singing, still a king. Speak his name then, and remember the self-crowned King of Rock and Soul, the preacher with the enormous family and the enormous heart, whose foundational classics the world still sings even as it forgets the man who made them. He wore his self-appointed crown with a twinkle in his eye, a showman of enormous appetite and enormous warmth who genuinely seemed to love every soul who came to hear him. and who left behind not only a catalog of foundational classics, but a sprawling family and a legend larger than life. His Grammy-winning comeback late in life was a rare and beautiful thing. Speak his name then, and remember the gospel-thundering king of rock and soul, still holding court somewhere in eternity. To stand at his grave in the Hollywood Hills is to remember a founding father of soul who lived enormously, loved enormously, and died still gloriously on the road. His early classics became foundational texts for the British bands who reshaped rock, another giant whose influence dwarfed his fame. Speak his name and let that gospel thunder roll again. He rests here now, the king of rock and soul whose crown the world set aside. Let us travel now to the Sumner Memorial Gardens in Gallatin, Tennessee, to the grave of Conway Twitty, one of the most successful country singers of all time. Twitty began as a rockabilly star, scoring a massive early hit, before reinventing himself as a country balladeer and amassing an astonishing number of #1 hits, more than almost anyone in the history of the genre. His smooth voice and romantic songs, and his beloved duets with a fellow country legend, making him a superstar for decades. But his death came suddenly, in 1993, of a stomach aneurysm while traveling home from a show, and in the years since, despite his staggering record of success, his name has faded from the wider culture with surprising speed, remembered now mostly by devoted country fans. He first found fame in the 1950s as a rock and roll singer, scoring a huge early hit with a dramatic ballad of longing, before making one of the most successful reinventions in music history, transforming himself into a country balladeer and going on to amass a staggering string of #1 hits, more at one time than any performer in the history of the genre. His smooth, romantic voice and his beloved duets with a fellow country legend made him a superstar for the better part of 3 decades. But he died suddenly and unexpectedly in 1993, of a burst blood vessel while traveling home from a show. And despite his almost unmatched record of success, his name has slipped from the general culture with startling speed. His monumental achievements, known now mostly to devoted country fans, his transformation from rockabilly heartthrob to country titan was one of the shrewdest and most complete reinventions in the history of music. And the sheer volume of his success, all those chart-topping records year after year, is almost impossible to overstate. And yet, tellingly, his grave bears not his famous stage name but the ordinary one he was born with, a fitting emblem of how quietly so vast a career has receded. Speak his name then, and remember the smooth balladeer of more #1s than almost anyone, who lies beneath his own plain name, half forgotten by the world he once ruled. For a period in the 1970s and 80s, he was simply one of the most dependable hitmakers in all of American music. His songs reaching the top of the country charts with an almost mechanical regularity, and his warm, intimate voice made him a favorite of a whole generation. That such a mountain of success could recede so quickly is a lesson in the impermanence of even the greatest fame. Speak his name then, and remember the rockabilly boy turned country titan who piled up more #1s than almost anyone alive. To stand at his grave in Tennessee, reading the plain birth name upon it, is to feel how strangely quiet even a mountain of #1 records can become once the world has moved along. Speak his name, and let one of those countless #1s play again. He rests here now, beneath his real name, the balladeer of countless #1s the world has half forgotten. Let us travel now to the Spring Hill Cemetery in Nashville, to the grave of Keith Whitley, a country singer of rare gifts who was taken just as his star began to rise. Whitley was a prodigy, a bluegrass wonder in his youth, alongside his friend Ricky Skaggs, who grew into one of the most soulful and authentic voices in country music, a leader of the neo-traditional movement whose tender, aching records seemed to promise a long and brilliant career. But he battled alcohol all his life, and in 1989, at just 34, that battle claimed him, cutting short his career at the very moment of his breakthrough. In a heartbreaking irony, several of his greatest hits climbed the charts only after his death, and his widow and his admirers have kept his memory alive against the world's forgetting. He was a once-in-a-generation talent, a boy who sang bluegrass so beautifully as a teenager, alongside his friend Ricky Skaggs, that the legendary Ralph Stanley reportedly mistook the two youngsters for one of his own records, and who grew into one of the most soulful and authentic voices in all of country music, the standard-bearer of a movement that returned the genre to its traditional roots. His tender, aching recordings seemed to promise decades of greatness to come. But he had wrestled with alcohol since his youth. And in 1989, at just 34, married to a rising country star and with his own career finally exploding, that lifelong battle took him. In a heartbreak almost too cruel to bear, some of his most beloved and successful records reached the top of the charts only after he was gone. His death sent a shockwave through country music, a warning and a heartbreak both. The loss of a talent so pure and so promising that his shadow still falls across the genre decades later, invoked by every singer who values authenticity and soul. His widow and his admirers have labored to keep his flame alive against the forgetting. Speak his name then, and remember the boy who sang bluegrass like an angel and grew into one of country's most soulful voices, silenced at 34 just as the whole world was about to listen. There is a whole imagined career that never was. The decades of music this gifted young man might have made had he lived, and country fans still speak of it wistfully, the great artist he was so plainly on the verge of becoming. His young widow went on to stardom of her own, and never stopped speaking of him as the love of her life. Speak his name then, and remember the purest country voice of his generation, gone at 34 with his greatest work just beginning. To stand at his grave in Nashville is to mourn not only the man but the decades of music that died with him, the great career that was just beginning to bloom. Speak his name and let that pure, aching voice sound once more across the years. He rests here now, the aching country voice silenced at 34, on the edge of greatness. And so we come to the final grave of our long and tender journey, and it belongs to a woman they called the First Lady of Country Music. Let us travel to the Woodlawn Cemetery in Nashville, to the grave of Tammy Wynette. Wynette rose from hardscrabble poverty and worked as a hairdresser to become the most successful female country singer of her era, her powerful, tear-catching voice delivering a string of monumental hits, including an anthem of Standing by One's Man that became one of the most famous country songs ever recorded. But her life was as turbulent as her songs, marked by a tempestuous marriage to another country legend, by chronic illness and terrible pain, by financial trouble and heartbreak, so that the queen of country heartache seemed to live out the very sorrows she sang. She died in 1998, at just 55. In a final strange indignity, the name on her tomb was for a time changed away from the one the world knew her by, before her daughter at last restored it. She rose from grinding rural poverty and a job cutting hair to become the most successful female country singer of her generation. Her extraordinary voice, with its signature catch and tremble, delivering a run of monumental hits, chief among them, a controversial and enormously popular anthem of loyalty that became one of the most famous country records ever made. But her life offered no shelter from the sorrows she sang about, marked as it was by a stormy and very public marriage to another country legend, by a lifetime of serious illness and chronic pain and repeated surgeries, and by financial ruin, so that the reigning queen of country heartache seemed condemned to live out the very lyrics that made her famous. She died in 1998 at just 55, and even in death was denied peace for a time, when the name on her crypt was quietly changed before her daughter fought to restore it. There is no clearer example in all of music of an artist condemned to live the sorrows she sang, for the woman who gave the world its greatest anthems of Standing by a Troubled Man endured a life of heartbreak, illness, and turmoil that would have broken almost anyone. That even her tombstone should have been tampered with after her death feels like one final cruelty visited on a woman who had already borne so many. Speak her name then, and remember the First Lady of Country Music, whose tear-catching voice made the whole world feel her heartbreak, because she truly felt it too. She was married 5 times, most famously and most tumultuously, to another towering country star, and their public battles and reconciliations became the stuff of legend, a real-life soap opera to match the melodramas of her songs. Through it all, she kept singing, kept performing even when she could barely stand, a trooper to the last. Speak her name then, and remember the First Lady of Country Music, whose trembling voice carried a lifetime of real and unhealed sorrow. To stand at her grave in Nashville, its restored name once more proclaiming who she was, is to remember a woman who gave the world its truest songs of heartbreak, because heartbreak was the one thing she was never spared. Speak her name, and let that trembling, tear-catching voice fill the quiet once more. She rests here now, the First Lady of Country Music, who sang her own heartbreak and lived it too. And so, dear friends, our long and tender walk among the ones who gave us a song comes at last to its close. We have wandered from the Bronx to Baton Rouge, from Detroit to the Hollywood Hills, And everywhere we have found the same bittersweet truth, that a song can outlive its singer by generations, filling the world with joy long after the voice that made it has been laid in the ground and, so often, forgotten. 30 of them we have visited now, 30 men and women who gave us the soundtrack of our lives, our first dances and our long drives and our broken hearts, and who asked in return only that we listen. Some of them were one-hit wonders who caught lightning a single time and never again. Some were great stars who blazed for years before the world moved on. But every one of them left us something precious, a melody, a voice, a 3-minute miracle that still has the power to stop us in our tracks when it drifts, unexpected, out of a radio. And every one of them lies now in a grave that too few remember to visit. So let us remember them, these faded voices, and let us play their songs, and let us be grateful, for they gave us more than they ever received in return. There is, I think, a quiet dignity to be found even here, at the end of so sorrowful a road. And it is this, that no one who ever gave the world a song truly dies so long as the song is sung, and that every time one of these old melodies drifts out of a passing car or a corner jukebox, its maker lives again for the length of 3 minutes, loved by someone who may not even know their name. That is a kind of immortality, humble but real, and it is more than most of us will ever have. Rest well then, all 30 of you, you one-hit wonders and forgotten stars, you who filled the world with music, and then slipped so quietly away, and know that tonight, at least, someone listened, and someone remembered, and someone said your names into the dark. You have been the kindest of fellow travelers, and I could have asked for none better on so bittersweet a walk. And rest well to you, my companions, who walked this tender road beside me. Pull out the dusty records and the forgotten playlists, and let these voices sing again in your kitchen or your car, for that is the only monument they ever truly wanted, and the only one that lasts. Go home and play the old songs, the ones nobody plays anymore, and think kindly of the ones who gave them to us. Go home and play the old songs, the ones nobody plays anymore, and think kindly of the ones who gave them to us. And until we walk together again, good night.